Haggard. It's a privilege, an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I thank you for the time to speak to me. And before we, of course, dive into my questions, would you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself and what you have done at Cambridge University in England? In past conversations, you've mentioned to me that you're semi-retired but still have relations. How is that going? And I'll divert.
Um, all fine. Well, I am now 82, born in 1942. I've had a full life in Scotland and England and 1 year in the US. Um, and at the moment, I'm just trying to make myself useful by giving statistical advice, and I have been lecturing also. I've just finished doing that. And I go backwards and forwards between Cambridge and London. We have family, grandchildren in London. Or I should say, we have had. They're now fled the nest. They're all at least at uni, and one of them is 30 and doing an extended tour of India.
That's incredible. All right, so I feel we need to give a little bit more context about you, and therefore my first questions are going to focus on the time you were raised in. You mentioned you were born in 1942, 2 years after the declaration of war between London and Nazi Germany in 1939. What's your earliest recollection of growing up during that time after the war? I imagine you were very young, you were just a child, and the war would end in 45. So what was it like to see the world emerge from such chaos and fall into a bit of a strange post-war period?
Yes, it's a good question. And I didn't know my father. I only knew London as a pre-memorial child. That's to say, I have one memory before we left London in November 44 of visiting my maternal grandfather in hospital. But we were bombed twice. And after the second time, my mother took my surviving elder brother, one had died in America in 1940, um, off to relatives in Scotland. And it was all very strange, but one only has the appreciation of a child to take in things as they happen. As time passed and we moved to a rather poor farm in central Scotland and started cutting down the blackthorns and trying to grow things, life was very simple. We were quite poor, but all the time everything was improving, and the dark moments of the war, the loss of the houses, the loss of my father, were receding into the past. And the common trope was that, everything is getting better. And that continued to be the case for 20 years, right into the mid-60s, certainly through all my school years, material conditions, technology and health and so on. Everything was just sort of getting better. But one didn't necessarily have a historical perspective on that. It was just the next thing that happened to happen.
So, with that, you would have seen changes and shifts in technology and in society over the years, and that's always a curiosity for me. Those who live through what our textbooks now consider historic moments in time, especially the post-war Cold War period after World War II. Did you ever imagine you might see the world as it is today, or was that unimaginable for you as a young man?
At that age, people weren't looking into the future and, saying, well, how can I make a profit out of it with quite the intensity that they do today. Um, so we were worried. The nightmare scenario was nuclear war, and that was there always in the background. Not a very focal consideration. We had friends who were communists and had what we thought was a naive view of Soviet Russia. Um, the Cuban Missile Crisis in the autumn and fall of 62 was scary. I was at university by then. Um, But the West was in a very different position. I think some of the things that are happening at the moment are actually much more scary. We have poisonings, attacks in this country. We have Russia cutting the Baltic power and communication cables. And indeed, there were 4 Bulgarian subcontracted spies for contemporary fascist Russia just sent to prison in open court in London a couple of days ago. So day by day, the Cold War didn't really impinge. It was far enough away. The improvements in technology that we saw were pretty domestic. They were electric record players. We didn't get electricity until 1957 because we were in a remote farm. So then there was a record player, and then eventually there were CDs. So it was more on the domestic and consumer front that we saw tangible technological progress. We finally got a post-war car. We got a Land Rover, which is a kind of Jeep. And things just gradually got better in ordinary ways. And I think that was true of a lot of people. We were an odd family, sort of London intellectuals growing up on a remote farm in Scotland. And so we rather stuck out. But I think that was very much the experience that a lot of people had.
So can I ask a little bit about Cambridge and what it was that drew you to be a professor at the university there? Or was it that you went to school yourself there for higher education? What was the journey to get there that you achieved, over all these years?
That's a very interesting question, because in the book that he wrote in 1940, after just having packed off my mother and 2 older brothers onto a liner to go to the US, he wrote, "I'll go to bed at noon." And in that he says he doesn't want his sons to go to Oxford or Cambridge because they are overly select and privileged places, etc., etc. Well, we didn't. My surviving elder brother and myself both went first to Edinburgh University, which is a good university. Then, by the time I was, about 2021, I felt this is a choice I can make for myself. And I wanted to do graduate work, i.e. to get a PhD from Cambridge, and I did that. And that was 63 through 66. There are ways in which the automatic privileged excellence of Cambridge is something with which I never fundamentally identified. I can work with it. I'm as bright and as verbal as the next guy. It's not a problem for me. But it wasn't something I drank like the best possible vintage wine or the most beautiful choral music. It wasn't something that turned me on as such. It was something I could negotiate and work within. Then we left Cambridge. I was then junior faculty in Cambridge, end of the 60s. We left Cambridge in 71, where at the age of 28, I was made to be a full professor in Queen's University, Belfast. So that was, at the time, almost a war zone because the so-called Troubles were happening and there were terrorist atrocities and various upheavals. That was a difficult time. So I'd had my experience of the real world before then moving to my career position, which was running a research unit on hearing and deafness for the Medical Research Council. And then I did 25 years in that job and then stepped aside before the retirement age to go back to Cambridge in order to teach and write.
Your life is phenomenal. It really is. You're just fascinating to listen to. If I remember my history correctly, though, between the UFO panic in the States in 47, the threat of nuclear war with the Soviets at the time, where was London in all of this, and more specifically, I suppose it's a little hard to frame this question, but in the grand scheme of things, how did this sort of environment propel you towards where you still are with Cambridge and psychology? Was there something that happened during that period of the 50s and the 60s and the era of unrest that actually influenced you towards this field?
Well, the Cold War was sort of always in the background. We were ready for it. UK also had nuclear weapons, but because we had a natural advantage in terms of power, and because of the strength of the transatlantic alliance, in which my grandfather, when he was consul general in New York, played a considerable part in putting together before America came into the war. That was always sort of around, it was a strengthening bulwark, which at the moment it isn't, because suddenly the current United States president has decided that NATO is not a good idea. I don't know where he got that idea, but that's how it seems to be at the moment. But we really weren't too worried about it. We sort of got on with life and progress and minor social problems, and those are what coloured the political debates. There were communists around in the wings, but a lot of people didn't take them too seriously. They weren't a real threat. Psychology. Well, my stepfather, who had been in the United States during the 30s, had been friendly with an American psychiatrist of whom you might have heard, Bill Sheldon, who had a theory about body types and their importance in personality. But he was not new to psychology, and likewise my mother, her father was a London general practitioner, but he had served in the First War with the men, and he had begun psychiatric treatment of what was then known as shell shock, or as we would now call it, post-traumatic stress disorder. So there was a background of interest in the human mind around, and I wasn't bad at science and maths, but I was more interested in culture and languages, and that's what I chose to study for my school subjects. But then I realized that, well, that's slightly limited. Unless you're going to work in the media or in something very literary, they're not much of a grounding. So I thought psychology would be a good balance, a good compromise, and I think in retrospect it did turn out to be.
Entirely, and I found that it was probably the most fascinating. It was probably one of the few science classes I actually thrived at. Whenever I was in college myself, I had a basic understanding of the foundational layers of psychology and the sciences behind it and the theories, and it was probably the only science class that I enjoyed was decent at in college myself. So I appreciate hearing that. To switch gears a touch, you've been mentioning your father, Stephen Haggard, very briefly throughout our conversation, and of course I have some of the books here that were your father's. There should be a photo of him, and I will bring it up. Beautiful photo of your father in Timeless Quest, which is a memoir about him, biography, about him. But I'm kind of curious, and you don't have to answer this, I have a lot of respect for you, but your father, Stephen Haggard, was quite a well-known stage actor, writer, and poet in the 30s, and I'm very much aware of the history there, much more than I can explain and express here, but through discussions and research, and as you've said, you really didn't get to know your father, because he passed away at the war. My question is, there is a release, and I have it with me, of a book about your father called Last Train from Jerusalem, which is the main basis for our current question here. My question for you then is, with the release of the latest book, what are the ups and downs of maintaining a legacy so convoluted and complicated like your father's?
This has been a very interesting challenge for me just these last couple of years. it was my older brother who was a director, stage and television director, who held the artistic legacy and knew about and had a sort of a feeling about his relation to my father. For me, he was a remote character. He was that beautiful sketch on the front of the book you've just shown on the wall at the farmhouse. And someone of whom people whom I would occasionally be say, oh, I saw your father in such and such a play and such a theatre back in 1939, and he was marvellous. He was a very good actor of a certain type and got rave reviews in London, on the continent, in Paris, to a limited extent in Germany before he withdrew from that, and when he came to New York. But he was a character sort of outside my life that I had to respect, but I sort of didn't feel that I knew him. That was the job of my brother. So my brother had all the papers, and the legacy maintenance task, which I now face, is suddenly with me because my brother has died, and the author, Ross Davies, was and still is, of that last book, still in rather poor health. So suddenly, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was sort of preparing to take over this role of engaging with the author and then eventually receiving back the family archive. And this is a role for which I was not very well prepared in terms of my own past interests and reading. I had read bits of the Hassel biography from 1947. I'd read I'll Go to Bed at Noon and so on. So I knew about him, but he was mainly this sort of object of adulation by other people for his mainly his acting. Now, he also wrote a rather interesting novel that was sort of picked up recently by a Cambridge literary professor as being a curiously interesting book from the late 30s. And he was actually a rather good poet, because he could do poetry while he was doing military training or on a ship going out to Egypt or whatever. He could, yes. And the poems are now, as far as I know, all published. But I still have 8 boxes to go through for the archiving, and I'm going to check them off one by one and just see that there isn't something there that has not yet been published and which ought to be brought to light. So I've been sort of rather plunged into sort of an artistic world, which I am familiar with as a consumer and not a producer, and also an archiving world, which is something a little bit new to me, although I know how to keep a coherent list of references for an article. So there's a bit of a job still to be done. But I'm approaching it positively and cheerfully. I will survive the task. I will get it done.
And as I have learned as well in doing my own research on your father these last couple of this year and a half now, it's coming up. Which was an accident, I will say. It was a complete accident. But the majority of the things I've shown are actually first editions. Including his poems, not on the first edition of the book, but it is the first edition of his poems and of the biography about him. But speaking on him further, there was something profound of his that kind of struck me when I was reading I'll Go to Bed at Noon. And it's something that I think is kind of befitting to his story, and now that it's kind of coming back into the light is... He said something along the lines of, the world likes to forget a hurt, and World War II was a hurt beyond all hurts. The Cold War as well, and everything subsequently after was a scab on top of that hurt. And as he said, people seem to forget it, and why do you think it is that maybe we might benefit from not forgetting hurts, and especially the lives like your father's and the stories of those who served, I feel, quite bravely in the face of insurmountable tribulations?
Yes, remembrance is important, unless we do it well and with a good grounding in fact, then it's hard to believe that young people, young men mainly in the past, who had to fight to preserve our freedoms would be willing to do it. And after the First War, when much greater numbers of soldiers were lost, there was a very large remembrance movement. And so, for example, church halls were going out of fashion, but civic halls were built up with remembrance funds from donations in memory of the fallen. Now, there are ways of doing it well and doing it badly. I think one has to be truthful. And the perpetual topic of what went wrong in Germany that led to Nazism and to the Holocaust may have been to do with them not remembering that what happened in the war, how it started. You know, Germany had invaded, and everything that went on. And I think that's part of what went wrong in between the war Germany. So I think it's an activity we need to think and talk about. How do we best remember? And that's the national inheritance. It's remembrance of individuals' contributions. Also the nature of the collective effort. What did we do well? What did we do not so well? And there are always some things that we don't do very well and some that we do well. So for example, in the case of the UK, cracking the Nazi Morse code coding mechanism for military signals and knowing when the planes and the ships were going to turn up ahead of time, but also knowing that you mustn't make it too obvious that actually you know this, else they'll guess and they'll change to something else. This was absolutely marvelous. And it was the Bletchley Park codebreakers, of whom the story is well known, who are thought by wiser and more experienced people than me in these matters to have shortened that war by about a year. So we did that bit well, but there are also things that we must remember that we did not do well. And, you know, we have to learn from them. And as well as remembering the sacrifices of individuals, which are sometimes with their lives, but just sometimes with effort and exhaustion or losing a limb or whatever. These various sacrifices, it's something that we do have to think about and try and do well. And the memorials can be of all sorts, having a statue of a soldier and so on. That's a splendid memorials. But there are other types as well in museums, archives, collections, and so on. There are lots of ways of keeping remembrance alive.
My next question is going to shift back a little bit to the career choices, but it's based on, you know, the history of your name behind you, the family name. Was there ever any pressure to kind of live up to the creative expectations? Your father, as we mentioned, was an actor and a writer, had a hand in a lot of creative fields. If anyone reads this, you're going to wonder what Stephen didn't do, what he really didn't do. He just was in everything, and his H. Rider Haggard had a hand in writing. Many of Stephen's siblings, I'm sure, were involved in creative fields as well. Did you surprise anybody whenever you sort of shifted to psychology versus something a little bit more in line with the family name?
Yes, interesting. Very good question. There was, of course, the Henry Rider Haggard, the great novelist of the late 19th and early 20th century, about a colonial world which, by the time I grew into full consciousness, was largely gone. I mean, in the 50s, we'd already parted with India in 1947. We were giving away vast tracts of Africa. You know, question about whether we should have been there in the first place, but you know, this is what happened. It was always expected that one should be able to write well. My mother wrote a little herself. She had been a stage manager, which is how she met Stephen. And occasionally, my older brother would write a poem, write a piece, as did I. Not so much, but because I didn't see myself as going very strongly in that direction. But there was certainly a family expectation of high literacy and the ability to express ideas in writing. So I got reasonably good marks for my English essays. But I didn't feel that I had to join the family business. No, I was rightly, my mother and stepfather were very good about that. Said, "Oh, this is a matter of free choice. You must choose what you're interested in, what you feel you're good at. There are no expectations upon you." And I think that is a parental duty. I think that is what we have to say to our children.
No, that's fascinating to me. I think it made it even more fascinating to think about, only because, in All Go to Bed at Noon, Stephen kind of outlines his ideas of expectations. Oh, I should have, or I would have, or like all the things that he, I think, wished or wanted or hoped for his sons seemed to be laid out, what he hoped, expected, or thought might happen. If he had come back, if he had been able to come back. Not that he had any guarantees that he would. Even if the circumstances were different. So it's interesting I guess, to kind of see where the path took you. Different from, I think, maybe his own hopes. And that does lead me back into him a little bit about the things that he did leave behind for you, be it memorabilia, photos, footage of himself in the few films he did, recordings, his letters to you, lovingly published through Farber and Farber in 1940. You really felt as if you stepped back into 1940 with him through his writing. But in regards to its impact on you, especially having to sort through it, which you mentioned is daunting, but you're trying your best with it, perhaps you can shed light on this. And you've mentioned having a difficulty of, knowing the man, but through all of this, do you feel as if you understand even a fraction of the man your father was, beyond the lights, beyond the stage lights, and just kind of into the man who he was personally?
I do, and particularly in this latter phase when coming to terms with the responsibility of managing his legacy. As a young man, I knew that he was very charming, extremely charming, likely to be a bit authoritarian and sound off about how he thought people should behave and how the world ought to be, but built on a sort of a personal twist that he had got when growing up. I think from his father, of a sense of natural authority and knowledge about certain things. So he wasn't a negotiator. He said, "Look, let's get together, pool our ideas. How are we going to solve this problem, guys?" No, that was not him. But we'd moved more into that sort of a world. So I didn't necessarily feel that how he had been as a personality necessarily held models for me, or that the sorts of things that he had done held models for me. I understand him better having gone back over the books, including one by my aunt. You mentioned his two sisters. One of them, Joan, was married to a diplomat who was also worked as part of the Atlantic Alliance and was important in the United Nations back in the 50s. But she herself was sort of content with being a diplomat's wife, and then with being a very dutiful daughter, looking after the elderly couple that were my grandparents. The other one was a total rebel, Virginia, a fascinating and intriguing, but in some ways immature woman. And she has written, some of it published, some of it unpublished, lots of interesting bits of background that I've recently gone over again. she lived with the artist Chagall for 7 years, and her best known bit of writing is called 7 Years with Chagall. And but they were all very, very different as children, and he had perhaps in teenage he had been somewhat sort of authoritative over his two sisters because he was a little older than they were.
Older brother
But then
should.
he went off to a
As an
boarding
older
school.
brother ought to be, maybe. Maybe.
I don't know. But then he was away at boarding school, and the family was something that met at an aunt's house in the holidays thereafter. So it was an odd sort of life in that period. That was before intercontinental flights, you see. Come the 1950s, and such children fly back and forward. And so they have a slightly more normal family. Those who are in international business or diplomacy have a slightly more normal family life these days because of intercontinental flights. Anyway, I now feel I do know much better what he was like, and that equips me for some of the subtler decisions in doing the archiving, deciding what goes with what is important, what is merely repetitive, and so on. There are lots and lots of letters between him and his parents and him and my mother. And those are, because those series are incomplete, you don't get the letter, then the reply, then the letter, and the reply. No. You get a bunch of one and then a few of the other. So that's going to be quite difficult. I think that's going to take longer. But of the archival papers, which I want to get into the university library as part of the Christopher Hassel collection. Christopher Hassel, my godfather, was his first biographer in 1947. So that they will be indexed and safe there for posterity. But there are a couple of other things that may take a bit longer to do. One is the press cuttings. There's a marvelous set of press cuttings. Now, they are ephemera, but they're sort of interesting, how they evolve over the years. And the other is the personal letters, which are very hard work because of people's bad handwriting. And my own handwriting is even worse, so who am I to talk? But because of the handwriting.
I've seen some of Stephen's handwriting. His signature was gorgeous. I've seen those on photos and stuff, but
It's stylish but not legible.
it's
So anyway, that's going to be hard work. So we'll get the basic task done, and then that's sort of task number two, or perhaps the cuttings is task number two because they are at least in print and can be read and reclassified and grouped, and might sort of write something about them just using the cuttings as a source, as a
I thought the Mozart one was
a
most
resource.
fascinating only because, I mean, that was how I had discovered your father was through his portrayal of Mozart, which I didn't realize he played
The
twice.
Mozart
I did
film.
not realize that, according
Yes.
at least to Christopher Hassel, in the biography, he was Mozart in Mesmer, in a stage play called Mesmer as well, which would later lead to Mozart, Whom the Gods Love, 1939. So
Yeah.
my next question dives into your mother, Morna, who you've mentioned very briefly. What was she like? In the recollection, of course, in the letters and other biographies, she sounded to me a very strong-willed woman, and I imagine had to have an immense amount of strength in the days that followed your father's active service, his loss, and then beyond it. And I believe that she deserves as much credit and respect as your father does in the story of their lives.
Yes. My father wasn't in the front line, but he worked very hard. The work on the broadcasting in German and English to the people of the Middle East and Turkey, and other secret work, it had him totally exhausted in 1942 and early 1943. My mother was more coping with difficulty, separation, loss, and practical circumstances. She was very practical. She was the daughter of a Scottish doctor, and grandmother Blanche, she had been in nursing. And she was a stage manager, which is a very practically oriented profession. And that's where they met, in the theatre in London. And she retained that sort of coping strategy, pretty cool under pressure, quite versatile, not technical, but just sort of generally capable. She retained that all through her life. She was really quite remarkable because she coped with the loss of her oldest child, my brother Paul, whom of course I never knew because he had departed before I was born. I discovered his birth certificate in Spanish. No, that Stephen's was in Spanish. Paul's was in German. He was born in Innsbruck in Austria. So I've been translating from the birth certificates of my father and my lost elder brother among these archival duties. She got with that. She recrossed the Atlantic, dodging the U-boats in a zigzagging convoy, and set up and ran a rest center for people, wounded people back from the front and so on, in London, until after losing everything a second time, she said, "Oh, enough, I'm off to Scotland." By which time she had met my stepfather, because he is an American citizen, served in the American army, and he was over setting up bases in the UK for the eventual assault on the continent. And they resolved after the war to marry and to run such farm as they could afford in Scotland. And she coped with that, and then having a young family and the very primitive conditions on the farm, and we too, my older brother Piers, who was a bit more of a handful than I was a fairly docile child, but I was probably noisy in my own way, and then three other younger children, and she ran the Women's Rural Institute for the local village. She coped with people of all walks of life. She didn't care who people were. If some member of the aristocracy walked into the yard, or some worker with some problematic background, she coped with them all, whoever they were. She was very good like that. And she brought up a family well, despite difficult conditions, and had a bit of a life as well. She returned to work eventually by the 60s, when the younger children had pretty much grown up. She did teaching in a local domestic science school, teaching them how to write sensible sentences in English, and just opening their lives to a bit more of the world than they might other have had.
She sounds. I still love the story that Christopher tells in Timeless Quest about their first meeting. That will never fail to just make me just smile. You're a snob. You're a snob. In relation to your father, I think being a bit stingy about a restaurant
Yes,
or
yes,
something, somewhere they were eating.
that's
It's
right.
what a
Yes, it was a place which was perhaps a bit rough, but she thought had character, and his idea of going out to dinner was to go somewhere a bit more classy.
well.
So she said, "Oh, you're a snob. You're a
It's
snob."
and like what a just I feel like her personality was just like what a pistol, what a but in the best way. She and beautiful too. I have seen the family photo of her. I think Piers and Paul. It was a beautiful woman. She was absolutely.
Yes, it, yes, in a non-flashy, very much a non-Hollywood, but as a younger woman, she was quite attractive. Eventually, many children and age took their toll upon her, but she was indeed. Some of those early
Absolutely,
pictures are
yeah.
lovely.
She was an incredible woman, and definitely deserves to be equally as remembered as much as her husband does. And so, in the closing, for our last question, I want to first thank you, of course, for joining me. I would like to salute the wartime service of your father.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's
Of
been great
course.
talking about
Oh,
it gingered up my archival
absolutely.
activities and
Absolutely.
memorial activities.
I wanna salute the wartime service of your father and honor him in my heart because he is deserving of remembrance. And with that, I want to ask my last question is once the task of keeping house is through for you, once the task of keeping house is through with the remnants of your father's life, what is the hope at the tail end of it all? Do you want to publish his works? Do you want to share what's been left out of the with a war museum if possible? I believe Stephen has been left out of these museums for very sensitive reasons, which I'm going to say for my podcast personally. I don't want to delve into it only because it's not hidden. It's complicated. And people sometimes get the idea that they can put a reason or that there is a reason, and there are things that we're never going to know. But we shouldn't make assumptions. You shouldn't assume that one thing led to another that led to someone's end. He passed away. It's incredibly sad, but he passed away, and he deserves our respect. He deserves respect for what he gave. But irregardless of that, do you think you would try to appeal to a war museum in light of everything that remains of Stephen's life? So, and what does the future for that hold with your part in all of this?
Yes, very good question. What should be in the record but isn't in it? Ross Davies, the author of the recent book, heard of Stephen and then started researching and finding out more about him, and considers him to have been a good war poet, and I think some of his latter poetry is rather good. He's not. If you do a Google search on war poets, you won't find him. You'll find names of good poets: Pamela Holmes, Alan Lewis, John McGee, and so on. And it would be nice if that, especially now that the poems are republished as an appendix in Ross Davies's book, if that got better recognised, and if for example, the Imperial War Museum, as we call it, the British War Museum, it's a good museum. If they were to have to update their feature on the war poets from the Second World War, who are, of course, much less well known than those from the First War, who were sort of folk heroes in the wake of the massive losses of personnel, which didn't quite happen that way with the Second War. Anyway, if there were such an upgrading of the exhibit, and if my father Stephen's poems could be included, I think that would be very good. And I think the Ross Davies books does help towards such a possible recognition. And of course, if I find any poems that are unquestionably his, which isn't quite as easy a question to answer as you might think if there's just some a typescript in a pile of papers. Who wrote this? When? If one can say beyond reasonable doubt that it is his, but it isn't in any of the existing collections, then there's a separate sort of job to do to say, well, look, here's another poem that ought to have been with these known ones in the collection. So that's something that might happen, but there's still a lot of paper to wade through before I get to that point.
But yes, absolutely. For anyone who watches our video version, these are some of the books that we have that are out there they're very hard to find sometimes, but this is I'll Go to Bed at Noon.
I'll Go to Bed at
Stephen,
Noon.
that is his memoir, his personal memoir. Of course, we have the Ross Davies novel, which is a beautiful photo of Stephen on it, last train from Jerusalem. I have a first
They,
edition
they,
of his
that's a
poems,
drawing sketch.
which I have to say, in relation to your, your final thoughts on that, they are beautiful, they are haunting, they're raw, they're real. I read one on Remembrance Day last year. Again, I'll probably read another one this year in memory of your father. And if you can, Christopher Hassel's biography is a beautiful picture of Stephen as well. Has beautiful illustrations, including several ones of Stephen in his uniform. They're difficult to find, but they're beautiful to
Yes,
have.
yes. Yeah, I think with searchability
Yes.
nowadays, they are findable. They're all findable. The biography by Christopher Hassel was written immediately post-war, without benefit of hindsight and a lot of material and so on. And for anyone particularly interested, it's worth reading. It's sort of a memoir of a particular, of him as an artist, as a writer, as an actor, and very much concentrated on the theatre. Whereas the Ross Davies book is more sort of comprehensive, better adapted to the modern
And
audience. But if anyone particularly
Yes,
interested,
and
there's
there
room
are
for
books
both.
as well that I don't have with me that tell more stories about Stephen. Of course, you have the memoirs by his sister, Virginia Haggard. You have the stories by his teacher, Wilfred Blunt, which you can find. It's expensive, but you can find that. And various colleagues, be it Peggy Ashcroft or just various people who he worked with. Stories are told throughout their personal memoirs and stories and books out there. You can find them. You just might have to dig just a little bit. But with that, we have come to the end of our questions. Thank you again, Professor
Yes.
Haggard, for joining me. And thank you to everyone who listens. Subscribe to the podcast for more, and I will see you all on the flip side.
Thank
Yes.
you. It's been a pleasure.